When Nora Bennett agreed to marry a paralyzed mafia boss to save her dying grandmother, she thought she understood the price of desperation. She was wrong. The contract promised money and freedom after 6 months. What it delivered was a mansion filled with armed men who despised her, a husband whose rage could shatter glass across a room, and enemies who saw her as the perfect weakness to exploit. But on their wedding day, when Dante Moretti forced his broken body to stand and claim her as his in front of a room full of wolves, everything changed. This is their story. If you're drawn to tales of dangerous love and second chances, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches across the world. The fluorescent lights in County General's ICU waiting room had been humming the same monotonous note for 3 hours, and Nora Bennett had memorized every water stain on the ceiling tiles above her head. Her scrubs still smelled like the breakfast shift at Morrison's Diner, burnt coffee and bacon grease, because she hadn't had time to change before the hospital called. Her phone sat dead in her lap. The charging cable she'd been meaning to replace for 2 weeks now, just another item on a list of things she couldn't afford. Ms. Bennett? Nora's head snapped up. Dr. Reeves stood in the doorway, his face carefully arranged in that expression doctors practiced, the one that said, "I'm about to ruin your life, but I'll do it gently." She stood too quickly, her legs unsteady after hours of sitting. "How is she?" "Your grandmother is stable for now." "Doctor." Reeves gestured for Nora to sit, then settled into the plastic chair beside her, his clipboard balanced on his knees. "But we need to talk about the next steps." Nora's stomach dropped. Nothing good ever followed that phrase. "The kidney transplant can't wait much longer," he continued, his voice low and careful. "We found a match, which is excellent news, but the surgery, the anti-rejection medications, the follow-up care, it's going to be expensive. Even with the insurance your grandmother has, we're looking at significant out-of-pocket costs." "How much?" Nora's voice came out steadier than she felt. Dr. Reeves glanced down at his clipboard, as if the numbers might have changed in the last 30 seconds. "Conservatively, between the procedure, hospital stay, and the first year of medication, you're looking at somewhere between $80,000 and $100,000. And that's if there are no complications." The number hit her like a physical blow. Nora made $11 an hour slinging plates at Morrison's, plus whatever tips the morning crowd felt generous enough to leave. She was in her second year of nursing school, which meant her schedule was a jigsaw puzzle of classes, clinical rotations, and work shifts that never quite covered rent and textbooks, let alone medical emergencies. Her savings account held $432. She'd checked that morning. "I don't have that kind of money," she said quietly. "I understand." Dr. Reeves' expression softened with genuine sympathy. "We can work with you on a payment plan, and there are programs that might help. But Nora, you need to understand, the transplant has to happen within the next 8 weeks, or we lose the donor match. After that, who knows when another kidney becomes available? Your grandmother doesn't have unlimited time." 8 weeks. Nora's mind raced through impossible calculations. Even if she picked up every extra shift Morrison's would give her, even if she dropped out of school and worked 3 jobs, there was no mathematical reality in which she could earn that much money in 2 months. "What happens if we can't pay?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Dr. Reeves hesitated, then met her eyes directly. "Then we wait and hope another match comes through. But Nora, your grandmother's kidney function is deteriorating. Every week we delay increases the risk of complications. I won't lie to you, without this transplant soon, the prognosis isn't good." After he left, Nora sat alone in that waiting room for another hour, staring at her dead phone and feeling the weight of helplessness settle into her bones. Her grandmother, the woman who had raised her after Nora's parents died in a car accident when she was 7, who had worked double shifts at the garment factory to keep food on the table, who had never once made Nora feel like a burden, was dying. And Nora couldn't save her. The cruelty of it was staggering. All the studying, all the sleepless nights, all the careful budgeting and sacrifice, and none of it mattered because she didn't have enough zeros in her bank account. She was halfway to the bus stop when her phone vibrated with a text from her roommate, Jenna. "Some guy came by looking for you. Left a card. Says it's urgent." Nora frowned at the message. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the word urgent sent a small spike of anxiety through her already frayed nerves. Debt collectors didn't usually make house calls, but stranger things had happened. The apartment she shared with Jenna was a fourth-floor walk-up in a building that had been recently renovated, according to the listing, which meant the landlord had slapped a coat of beige paint over the water damage and called it good. Nora climbed the stairs slowly, exhaustion settling into her muscles like wet sand. Jenna was sprawled on their second-hand couch, chemistry textbook open across her lap, and highlighter tucked behind her ear. She looked up when Nora walked in, her expression somewhere between curious and concerned. "Long day?" Jenna asked. "You have no idea." Nora dropped her bag by the door and kicked off her shoes. "What's this about a guy looking for me?" Jenna reached for the business card sitting on the coffee table and held it out. He was weirdly polite, like too polite. "Suit probably cost more than our rent. He asked if you lived here. I said yes, and he handed me this and left." Nora took the card. Heavy stock, expensive, no logo, just a name embossed in black, Julian Cross, and a phone number. "Did he say what he wanted?" Nora asked. "Just that it was time sensitive and you should call him tonight." Jenna's eyes narrowed. "Should I be worried? Is this like a secret rich relative situation, or are you in some kind of trouble?" "I have no idea who this is." Nora turned the card over, but the back was blank. "Did he seem threatening?" "No, just intense. Very, I know something you don't energy." Jenna closed her textbook. "Are you going to call?" Nora looked at the card again, then at her dead phone, then at the stack of bills on the counter that she'd been strategically ignoring for the past week. The smart thing would be to throw the card away, ignore whatever this was, and focus on the disaster already consuming her life. But desperation made people do stupid things. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I'm going to call." Julian Cross answers on the second ring, his voice smooth and cultured, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had never worried about money in his entire life. "Ms. Bennett, thank you for calling. I assume you're wondering why I reached out." Nora sat on the edge of her bed, phone pressed to her ear, every instinct screaming that this was a mistake. That would be a good place to start. "I represent someone who has a rather unusual proposition for you, one that could solve a very pressing problem you're currently facing." Nora's blood went cold. "How do you know about my grandmother?" "I make it my business to know things, Miss Bennett. It's what I'm paid to do." There was no malice in his tone, just simple fact. "Your grandmother needs a transplant. You need money. My client can provide that money in exchange for a service." "What kind of service?" Nora's voice came out harder than she intended. "A legal marriage contract, 6 months, after which you'll receive a substantial payment and be free to walk away. Your grandmother's medical expenses will be covered in full immediately. All you have to do is say yes." Nora almost hung up. Almost. But the number, $80,000 to $100,000, echoed in her head like a drum beat. "Who's your client?" she asked. "I'd prefer to discuss the details in person. Are you available tomorrow evening? I can send a car." "I work tomorrow evening. Then I'll make it worth your while to call in sick." Julian's voice remained perfectly pleasant, as if they were discussing dinner plans rather than something that sounded increasingly like a crime. 7 o'clock. The car will pick you up at your address. Wear something nice but not too formal. You're meeting a businessman, not attending a gala." "I haven't agreed to anything," Nora said sharply. "Not yet," Julian replied. "But you will. Because you're desperate, and I'm offering you the only way out. 7 o'clock, Ms. Bennett. Don't be late." He hung up before she could respond. Nora sat in the dark of her bedroom, phone still pressed to her ear, listening to dead air. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was insane, that legitimate job offers didn't come from mysterious strangers with expensive business cards and vague propositions. This was how people ended up trafficked, or worse, but rationality was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. The car that arrived at 7 o'clock the next evening was a black Mercedes with windows tinted so dark Nora couldn't see inside. The driver, a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit who introduced himself only as Mr. Chen, opened the rear door without a word and waited. Nora had agonized over what to wear, finally settling on the one dress she owned that didn't look like it came from a clearance rack, a simple navy sheath she'd bought for her grandmother's 75th birthday dinner. She'd curled her hair, put on the minimal makeup she owned, and tried to look like someone who belonged in the back of a Mercedes. She failed spectacularly. The interior of the car smelled like leather and expensive cologne. Mr. Chen drove in silence, navigating through the city with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew these streets intimately. Nora watched the neighborhoods change through the window, her cramped, graffiti-tagged corner of the city giving way to tree-lined streets and buildings that actually had doormen. They pulled up to a restaurant Nora had walked past 100 times but never imagined entering. The kind of place where the menu didn't list prices because if you had to ask, you couldn't afford it. Julian Cross was waiting at a corner table, his suit as impeccable as Jenna had described. He stood when Nora approached, extending a hand. "Ms. Bennett, thank you for coming." His handshake was firm, professional. He gestured for her to sit, and a waiter appeared instantly with water and a wine list. "I don't drink," Nora said quickly. "Water is fine." Julian dismissed the waiter with a subtle nod, then turned his full attention to Nora. "I'll get straight to the point, because I suspect you don't have patience for small talk, and frankly, neither do I. My client is a businessman who finds himself in a complicated situation. Due to certain contractual obligations related to his family's holdings, he must be legally married by a specific date or risk losing control of a substantial empire. He needs a wife, you need money. It's a simple exchange." "Nothing about this sounds simple," Nora said flatly. Julian smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "Fair. Let me be more specific. The marriage would be entirely legal, but completely private. You would live in my client's home for 6 months, maintain the appearance of a legitimate marriage, and at the end of that period, you would receive $200,000. Your grandmother's medical expenses would be paid in full, and you would sign a non-disclosure agreement that ensures you never speak about the arrangement. $200,000. The number was so absurd that Nora almost laughed. "And what does your client get out of this besides a fake wife?" she asked. "Control of his family's business interests, which I assure you are worth considerably more than $200,000. Julian leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of clinical assessment that made Nora feel like a specimen under glass. "You were selected very carefully, Ms. Bennett. You're intelligent, resourceful, and most importantly, you have a compelling reason to say yes and every reason to keep quiet after." "Selected?" Nora repeated. "You mean investigated." "Due diligence," Julian corrected smoothly. "My client doesn't make decisions lightly, and neither should you. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. 6 months of your life in exchange for financial security and your grandmother's health. Most people would consider that a fair trade." "Most people aren't being asked to marry a stranger." "True." Julian pulled a folder from the briefcase at his feet and slid it across the table. "Which is why I'm prepared to answer your questions. Within reason." Nora opened the folder. Inside was a contract, dense legal language that would take a lawyer to properly decipher, and a single photograph. The man in the photo was younger than she'd expected, maybe early 30s, with dark hair and darker eyes that stared directly at the camera with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. He was handsome in a sharp, dangerous way, the kind of face that belonged to someone used to getting exactly what they wanted. But what caught Nora's attention, what made her breath catch in her throat, was the wheelchair. "He's disabled," she said quietly. Julian's expression flickered, surprise maybe, or approval. "My client was injured several months ago, an accident. He's currently unable to walk, though his doctors are optimistic about his long-term recovery. And he needs a wife because the terms of his family's trust require him to be married by his 33rd birthday, or control of the business passes to his cousins. That birthday is in 45 days. Julian's voice remained perfectly neutral, but something in his eyes sharpened. The injury complicated things. His previous engagement ended after the accident. He doesn't have time to find someone through conventional means, and frankly, he doesn't have the patience for romance. He needs a solution. You're that solution." Nora looked down at the contract again, at the endless paragraphs of legal terminology that basically boiled down to sign your life away for 6 months. "What's his name?" she asked. Julian hesitated, then leaned forward. "Dante Moretti." The name meant nothing to Nora, but the way Julian said it, with a kind of weighted significance, suggested it should. "Should I know who that is?" "No," Julian said slowly, "and that's precisely why you're perfect. Dante operates in circles that don't intersect with yours. You have no connections to his world, no history, no complications. You're a blank slate. After 6 months, you walk away, and neither of you ever crosses paths again. It sounded too easy. Nothing in Nora's life had ever been easy. "What's the catch?" she asked. Julian smiled again, and this time it was almost genuine. "The catch, Ms. Bennett, is that Dante Moretti is not an easy man. He's demanding, controlling, and his temper is legendary. The injury has made him worse. You would be living in his home, subject to his rules, and expected to play the role of devoted wife whenever required. It won't be comfortable and it won't be pleasant, but it will be temporary. And if I say no, then you go back to your life, your grandmother stays on the transplant waiting list, and we find someone else." Julian's voice softened slightly. "But we both know you're not going to say no. Not when the alternative is watching someone you love die because you couldn't save them." The words hit like a slap, precisely because they were true. Nora closed the folder, her hands trembling slightly. "I need time to think." "You have 24 hours, Julian said. "After that, the offer expires and we move on to our second choice. My card has my direct number. Call me with your decision." Nora didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the contract and photograph spread across her desk like evidence of a crime she hadn't yet committed. Every logical argument against this insane plan ran through her head on an endless loop. She didn't know these people. She had no guarantee they'd actually pay. She could be walking into a trap. This could be illegal, dangerous, or worse. But underneath all the logic was a simpler, more brutal truth. Her grandmother was dying, and Nora couldn't save her. Not with diner tips and prayer, not with student loans and hope. The only way to save her was to do something desperate. At 3 a.m, Nora got up, booted her ancient laptop, and started searching for information on Dante Moretti. What she found made her blood run cold. The legitimate news sources were sparse. A few business articles about Moretti Holdings, mentions of real estate developments and construction contracts, a photo from a charity gala 3 years ago showing Dante in a tuxedo shaking hands with the mayor. He looked every inch the successful businessman, polished, powerful, untouchable. But when Nora dug deeper into the kind of forums and gossip sites she normally avoided, the story became darker. Whispers about organized crime, allegations of money laundering, racketeering, ties to drug trafficking. Nothing concrete, nothing proven, but enough smoke to suggest a very large fire. And then she found the news story from 6 months ago. Local businessman survives assassination attempt. The article was brief, offering few details beyond the basics. Dante Moretti had been shot multiple times during an ambush outside a restaurant downtown. 3 men died at the scene. Moretti survived, barely. The police investigation was ongoing, no arrests had been made, and the Moretti family had declined to comment. Nora stared at the screen, her stomach twisting. This wasn't just a complicated family business situation. This was organized crime. Dante Moretti wasn't some eccentric billionaire looking for a convenient arrangement. He was a mafia boss who'd been shot, paralyzed, and now needed a wife to maintain his grip on power. She should run, should delete Julian's number, burn the contract, and forget any of this ever happened. Instead, she picked up her phone and stared at the photo of her grandmother saved as her lock screen. The picture had been taken last Christmas, back when her grandmother could still smile without the pain showing through. Back when Nora still believed hard work and good intentions were enough to protect the people you loved. She was so tired of being powerless. At 7 o'clock that morning, Nora called Julian Cross. "I'll do it," she said when he answered, "but I want the contract reviewed by a lawyer. I want my grandmother's surgery scheduled immediately, and I want half the payment up front." There was a pause. Then Julian's smooth voice came through, tinged with what might have been respect. "I'll have the revised contract to you by this afternoon. The surgery will be scheduled within the week. And Ms. Bennett, welcome to the family." The wedding was scheduled for 30 days later, which gave Nora exactly enough time to second-guess every decision she'd ever made. The contract, once reviewed by a lawyer Jenna's uncle recommended, was airtight. Nora would receive $100,000 upon signing, with the remaining $100,000 paid after the 6-month term ended. Her grandmother's medical expenses would be covered in full, no caps, no questions asked. In exchange, Nora would live at the Moretti estate, maintain the appearance of a legitimate marriage, attend any public functions Dante required, and sign a non-disclosure agreement so comprehensive it basically ensured she could never write a memoir. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Chen, who charged $200 an hour and was worth every penny, had looked at Nora over her reading glasses and asked, "Do you understand what you're agreeing to?" "Yes," Nora had said. "And you're doing this of your own free will? No one is coercing you?" Nora thought about her grandmother, about the way her hand shook now when she tried to hold a coffee cup, about the exhaustion that had settled into her bones like lead. "Yes," she said again. "I'm doing this because I choose to." Patricia had nodded slowly, signed off as witness, and handed Nora a business card. "If anything goes wrong, and I mean anything, you call me, immediately. Understand?" Nora had pocketed the card and tried not to think about what anything might mean. The money arrived in her account the next morning. $100,000, an amount so absurd that Nora stared at her banking app for 10 minutes, convinced it was a mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. It was real, and it meant her grandmother's surgery was scheduled for the following week, and Nora could breathe for the first time in months. The cost of that breath, apparently, was her next 6 months. Julian handled everything with terrifying efficiency. Nora's grandmother was moved to a private room at a better hospital. The transplant team was assembled. The surgery was scheduled. And through it all, Nora felt like she was watching someone else's life unfold, like she'd stepped sideways into a reality that couldn't possibly be her own. She didn't meet Dante until 3 days before the wedding. Julian picked her up in the same black Mercedes, drove her through increasingly affluent neighborhoods until they reached a gated estate that looked like it belonged in a movie. The house, if you could call something that sprawling a house, was all stone and glass and sharp angles, surrounded by manicured gardens and enough security cameras to make a prison jealous. Mr. Chen opened her door, and Julian appeared from the front entrance, his expression pleasant and utterly unrevealing. "He's in the library," Julian said, gesturing for Nora to follow. "Try not to look too terrified. He finds it annoying." "I'm not terrified," Nora lied. Julian's smile suggested he knew better. The library was exactly what Nora would have expected. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather furniture, the kind of space designed to intimidate. And in the center of it all, backlit by the afternoon sun streaming through massive windows, was Dante Moretti. He looked different than his photo. Older, harder, the kind of tired that came from pain rather than lack of sleep. He sat in a sleek, expensive wheelchair, his hands resting on the armrests with a tension that suggested he wanted to be anywhere else. When his eyes found Nora, she felt the full force of his attention like a physical weight. "So," Dante said, his voice rough and edged with something that might have been contempt, "you're the solution to my problem." Nora lifted her chin, refusing to flinch. "And you're mine. I guess that makes us even." Something flickered across Dante's face. Surprise, maybe, or the ghost of amusement. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." It wasn't a request. Nora sat. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, two strangers bound together by desperation and contracts. Finally, Dante leaned back slightly, his jaw tight. "Julian tells me you're smart," he said. "That you don't scare easily. Is that true?" "I'm here, aren't I?" Nora replied. "You're here because you need money. That's not the same as courage." Dante's eyes narrowed. "Let's be clear about something. This marriage is a business arrangement, nothing more. You'll live in this house, you'll show up when required, and you'll play your part. In return, you get paid. But don't mistake convenience for intimacy, and don't expect me to pretend this is anything other than what it is." The words were meant to sting, and they did. But Nora had spent the last 2 years slinging breakfast plates for customers who treated her like furniture. She knew how to take a hit. "I don't expect anything from you except what's in the contract," she said evenly. "You get your wife, I get my money, and in 6 months we never have to see each other again. That works for me." Dante's expression shifted again, something almost like respect crossing his features. "Good. Then we understand each other." "One thing," Nora added, her voice harder than she felt. "I'm not your employee, and I'm not your decoration. If we're doing this, we do it with basic respect. You don't talk to me like I'm disposable, and I won't treat you like a walking paycheck. Deal?" The silence that followed was so absolute that Nora could hear her own heartbeat. Then, slowly, Dante smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Deal," he said softly. This might actually be interesting. The wedding took place in a private room at the courthouse, witnessed by Julian, a judge whose signature had clearly been purchased, and two security guards who looked like they could bench press a car. Nora wore a simple white dress she'd found at a consignment shop. Nothing fancy, because this wasn't that kind of wedding. Dante wore a black suit, his wheelchair positioned beside her at the front of the room, his face carved from stone. The ceremony lasted 7 minutes. When the judge asked if Dante took Nora to be his lawfully wedded wife, he said, "I do," in a voice completely devoid of emotion. When Nora was asked the same question, she looked at Dante, at this stranger she was legally binding herself to, and thought about her grandmother, recovering in a hospital bed because Nora had been desperate enough to make this devil's bargain. "I do," she said. The judge pronounced them married. No one clapped. Julian handed Nora a ring, a platinum band with a diamond so large it looked obscene, and she slid it onto her finger, feeling the weight of it like shackles. Then it was done. Nora was Mrs. Dante Moretti, and the next 6 months of her life belonged to a man who looked at her like she was a problem he hadn't quite figured out how to solve. As they left the courthouse, Dante's hand suddenly shot out, catching her wrist. She stopped, startled, and he looked up at her from his wheelchair, his expression unreadable. "Don't make me regret this," he said quietly. Nora met his eyes, seeing the warning there, the threat beneath the words. "Same to you," she replied, and pulled her wrist free. As Mr. Chen loaded Dante's wheelchair into the car, and Julian held the door open for Nora. She caught her reflection in the tinted window. A girl in a white dress with a stranger's ring on her finger, and no idea what she'd just signed up for. The car pulled away from the courthouse, carrying Nora toward a mansion, a marriage, and a man whose world was about to collide with hers in ways neither of them could have predicted. Behind them, the city disappeared into the distance, and ahead, the Moretti estate waited like a beautiful, terrible prison. Nora's new life had begun, and there was no going back. The Moretti estate revealed itself in layers, each one more intimidating than the last. The main house sprawled across what had to be 5 acres of pristine grounds, all sharp modern architecture softened by strategic landscaping that probably required a full-time staff. As the car wound up the private drive, Nora counted security cameras, noted the guard station half hidden by carefully pruned hedges, and realized with a sinking feeling that she hadn't just married into wealth, she'd married into a fortress. Mr. Chen opened her door, and Nora stepped out onto gravel that crunched beneath her sensible heels. The white dress suddenly felt ridiculous, a costume for a play she didn't know how to perform. Dante's wheelchair was already being unloaded by a second security guard, the movement efficient and practiced, suggesting this wasn't the first time they'd done this. "Welcome home, Mrs. Moretti," Julian said, appearing at her elbow with that unsettling smile that never quite reached his eyes. The title felt foreign in her mouth, like speaking a language she'd only read in books. Nora didn't respond, just followed as they moved toward the entrance, a massive double door made of dark wood and frosted glass that probably cost more than her entire education. Inside, the house opened into a foyer that could have swallowed her apartment whole. Marble floors, a staircase that curved upward like something out of a movie, and artwork on the walls that Nora suspected was original rather than prints. Everything gleamed with the kind of perfection that came from having people whose entire job was maintaining surfaces. A woman appeared from a side hallway, older, maybe mid-50s, with steel gray hair pulled into a severe bun and an expression that suggested she'd seen everything and been impressed by none of it. "Mrs. Castellano," Dante said, his voice shifting into something that might have been respect. "This is Nora, my wife. She'll need the East Wing prepared." The woman's eyes flicked to Nora, assessment and dismissal happening in the span of a heartbeat. "Of course, Mr. Moretti. I've already had the staff prepare the rooms. Will you be requiring anything else?" "Privacy," Dante said flatly. "And tell Marcus I want a security briefing in an hour." Mrs. Castellano nodded and disappeared as silently as she'd arrived, leaving Nora standing in the middle of that enormous foyer, feeling like an intruder in someone else's life. "The East Wing," Nora repeated, looking at Dante. "Separate rooms? Did you expect to share mine?" Dante's voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "This is a contract, not a romance. You have your space, I have mine. We maintain appearances when necessary. Otherwise, we stay out of each other's way. It shouldn't have stung. They'd been clear about the terms, about the nature of this arrangement, but somehow it did anyway. Nora swallowed the feeling and lifted her chin. Fine, she said. Show me where I'm supposed to exist for the next 6 months. Something flickered across Dante's face, too quick to identify. He gestured toward a hallway on the right. Julian will give you the tour. I have work to do. He moved his wheelchair with practiced efficiency, disappearing through a doorway that led deeper into the house, leaving Nora alone with Julian and the growing realization that she'd just signed up for the loneliest 6 months of her life. Julian's tour was thorough and impersonal, narrating the house like a real estate agent showing a property rather than introducing someone to their new home. The east wing consisted of a bedroom suite larger than Nora's entire apartment, complete with a sitting area, walk-in closet, and bathroom that looked like something from a luxury hotel. The furniture was modern and expensive, all clean lines and neutral tones, beautiful in the way things were beautiful when they'd never been lived in. Your belongings will be moved here tomorrow, Julian said, standing in the doorway while Nora tried to process the sheer size of the space. Mrs. Castellano manages the household staff. If you need anything, ask her. Meals are served at 7, 1, and 7, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. If you prefer to eat in your room, just let the kitchen know. And Dante? Nora asked. Where is he? Mr. Moretti's rooms are in the west wing. The library, his office, and the physical therapy room are on the first floor. He keeps his own schedule. Julian paused, his expression carefully neutral. A word of advice, Mrs. Moretti. Don't take his moods personally. The injury changed him. He's not an easy man to be around right now. I gathered that, Nora said dryly. Julian almost smiled. You'll have a clothing allowance. Use it. There will be events, dinners, occasions where you'll need to look the part. Mrs. Castellano has a list of acceptable boutiques and a stylist on retainer. The absurdity of it hit Nora all at once. She was standing in a mansion, wearing a stranger's ring, being told she had a clothing allowance, and a stylist while her grandmother recovered from surgery in a hospital across town. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. When can I see her? Nora asked quietly. My grandmother. When can I visit? Whenever you like, Julian replied. You're not a prisoner here, Mrs. Moretti. You're free to come and go. Just let security know when you're leaving. Security. Right. Because nothing said freedom like armed guards tracking your movements. Julian left her alone after that, and Nora stood in the middle of her new bedroom, her temporary bedroom, she corrected herself, and tried to figure out how her life had spiraled so far from anything she'd imagined. The sun was setting beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the manicured grounds in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in this massive house, Dante was doing whatever mafia bosses did when they weren't terrifying their contract wives. And Nora was alone, surrounded by luxury she'd never asked for, trapped in a bargain she couldn't escape. She pulled out her phone and called the hospital. Her grandmother answered on the third ring, her voice weak but warm. Nora, sweetheart, I wasn't expecting to hear from you tonight. How are you feeling? Nora asked, sitting on the edge of the bed that probably cost more than a used car. Better every day. The doctors say the transplant was a success. They're very pleased with how I'm recovering. Her grandmother's voice softened. I still don't understand how you managed to pay for all this. You said it was a scholarship program, but it was, Nora lied, the words coming easier than they should have. A medical scholarship for nursing students. They covered everything. What a blessing, her grandmother murmured. I'm so proud of you, Nora. So proud. Nora closed her eyes against the burn of tears. I love you, Grandma. I'll come visit tomorrow, okay? After she hung up, Nora sat in the growing darkness and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd done. She'd sold 6 months of her life to save her grandmother, and she'd do it again in a heartbeat. But that didn't make the cost any less brutal. Dinner arrived at 7, delivered by a young woman in staff uniform who set up a tray on the sitting room table and disappeared without making eye contact. The food was restaurant quality, some kind of chicken dish with vegetables Nora couldn't identify, and a wine she didn't drink, and she ate alone, staring out the window at grounds she couldn't explore in the dark. She didn't see Dante again that night. The next morning, Nora woke to sunlight streaming through windows she'd forgotten to cover, and the disorienting realization that she was in a strange bed in a strange house, married to a strange man. For a moment, she considered the possibility that the last 24 hours had been some kind of stress-induced fever dream. Then she saw the ring on her finger, and reality settled back into place with crushing finality. Mrs. Castellano appeared at 9 with a brisk knock and an expression that suggested patience was not her strong suit. "Mr. Moretti requests your presence in the physical therapy room," she said, her tone making it clear this was not actually a request. "He's on the first floor west side. I'll show you." Nora dressed quickly in jeans and a sweater, her own clothes, brought over late last night while she slept, and followed Mrs. Castellano through hallways that all looked the same, past rooms she hadn't yet explored, until they reached a space that had clearly been converted from something else into a private gym. Dante was there, dressed in athletic gear, his wheelchair positioned beside a set of parallel bars that looked like medieval torture devices. A man in medical scrubs stood nearby, clipboard in hand, his expression professionally encouraging in a way that suggested he'd had to perfect that look. "Mrs. Moretti," the therapist said, extending a hand. "I'm Dr. Ross. I've been working with your husband since the injury." Nora shook his hand, acutely aware of Dante's eyes on her, watching, measuring. "Nice to meet you." "I wanted you to observe today's session," Dante said, his voice flat. "Since you're going to be living here, you should understand what this looks like." It wasn't concern for her feelings. Nora understood that immediately. This was Dante establishing dominance, showing her exactly how broken he was so she wouldn't harbor any illusions about their arrangement. It was a power play disguised as transparency. "Okay," Nora said simply, and pulled up a chair. What followed was 2 hours of the most brutal, agonizing physical therapy Nora had ever witnessed. Dr. Ross guided Dante through exercises designed to rebuild strength, test nerve response, encourage muscle memory. Dante attacked each one with a fury that was almost frightening, pushing past pain that showed in every line of his face, in the sweat that soaked through his shirt, in the white-knuckled grip he maintained on the parallel bars. He fell twice. Both times he dragged himself back up with help from Dr. Ross, refusing the wheelchair, refusing rest, refusing anything that looked like weakness. And through it all, he never made a sound. No complaints, no curses, nothing. Just silent, grinding determination. Nora watched and understood something fundamental. Dante Moretti would rather die than accept his limitations. The wheelchair wasn't just a mobility device. It was a cage he was trying to break out of through sheer force of will. When the session finally ended, Dante was trembling with exhaustion, his face gray beneath the stubble. Dr. Ross helped him back into the wheelchair despite Dante's obvious desire to refuse the assistance. "Good work today, Doctor," Ross said, making notes on his clipboard. "We're seeing real progress. At this rate, you might be using a walker by next month." "I don't want a walker," Dante said through gritted teeth. "I want to walk. There's a difference." "And you will," Dr. Ross said with practiced calm. "But you have to give your body time to heal. Pushing too hard will set you back, not move you forward." Dante's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. After Dr. Ross left, silence filled the therapy room, broken only by Dante's heavy breathing and the distant sound of someone vacuuming in another part of the house. "You can go," Dante finally said, not looking at Nora. "The show's over." Nora stood, but didn't leave immediately. "How long have you been doing this? The therapy?" 4 months. Since I could tolerate sitting upright without passing out." His voice was bitter, self-directed. "Why? Feeling sorry for me?" "No," Nora said honestly. "I'm impressed." That got his attention. Dante's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Impressed? You're fighting. Most people would have given up by now." Nora met his gaze steadily. "I spent 2 years working in a hospital cafeteria. I saw patients in rehab all the time. Most of them did the bare minimum and complained the whole time. You're doing everything Dr. Ross asks, and then some. So yeah, I'm impressed." For a long moment, Dante just stared at her, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Then he laughed, a short, harsh sound devoid of humor. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said. "This isn't noble determination. This is desperation. I need to walk because if I'm stuck in this chair permanently, I lose everything. My business, my reputation, my ability to control what happens around me. So don't romanticize what you're seeing. It's survival, nothing more. Isn't that what makes it impressive? Nora asked quietly. The fact that you're surviving? Dante's expression shuttered closed, walls slamming back into place. Get out. Dante, I said get out. His voice dropped to something dangerous. I don't need your pity, your admiration, or your presence. You're here because I'm paying you to be here. Don't forget that. The words landed like blows, precisely calculated to hurt. Nora felt her face flush, anger rising to meet the humiliation. Fine, she said coldly. Enjoy your therapy. I'll be sure to stay out of your way. She walked out before he could respond, her hands shaking with suppressed fury. Behind her, she heard something crash. Dante throwing something against the wall, probably, and forced herself to keep walking. Mrs. Castellano appeared from nowhere as Nora reached the foyer, her expression revealing nothing. Mr. Chen is waiting to take you wherever you'd like to go, she said. I believe you mentioned wanting to visit the hospital? Nora nodded, not trusting her voice. She grabbed her jacket and purse, desperate to escape this house, this marriage, this impossible situation she'd walked into with open eyes and no real understanding of the cost. The drive to the hospital gave her time to cool down, to rebuild the walls Dante had somehow managed to crack with his brutal honesty. By the time Mr. Chen dropped her at the entrance, Nora had convinced herself that Dante was right. This was a transaction, nothing more. His pain wasn't her problem. His struggle wasn't her responsibility. She was here to play a role, collect her payment, and leave. Getting emotionally invested would only make everything harder. Her grandmother was sitting up in bed when Nora arrived, color returning to her cheeks, the monitors around her beeping with reassuring regularity. She smiled when she saw Nora, and for the first time in months, that smile reached her eyes. Look at you, her grandmother said, reaching for Nora's hand. So beautiful. Are you sleeping enough? You look tired. I'm fine, Grandma, Nora said, settling into the chair beside the bed. Just adjusting to a new schedule. They talked for an hour, her grandmother filling Nora in on the gossip from the nurse's station, the physical therapist who apparently looked like a young Paul Newman, the flowers that kept arriving from her church group. Normal things, safe things, conversation that had nothing to do with contract marriages or mafia bosses or the surreal new life Nora was trying to navigate. When visiting hours ended, Nora kissed her grandmother's forehead and promised to return tomorrow. Walking back through the hospital corridors, past the cafeteria where she used to work, she felt the dissonance again. One foot in her old life, one foot in something she still couldn't quite believe was real. Mr. Chen was waiting in the parking lot, patient and silent as always. The drive back to the estate felt shorter, or maybe Nora was just getting used to the route, to the transition between worlds. The house was quiet when she returned, most of the staff gone for the evening. Nora headed straight for her wing, planning to hide in her room and avoid any further confrontations with her temporary husband. She made it halfway down the hall before she heard voices. Dante's, sharp with anger, and someone else's, lower and defensive. Told you to handle it quietly, Dante was saying, his voice carrying from somewhere nearby. Not make it a public spectacle. With the respect, sir, there was no quiet way to handle Marco's betrayal, the other voice replied. Male, older, with an accent Nora couldn't place. He was stealing from shipments, skimming profits, feeding information to the Vitales. We had to make an example. And now we have the FBI crawling up our ass because someone found a body in the river, Dante snapped. Brilliant strategy, Marcus, really subtle. Nora froze, her heart suddenly pounding. A body in the river, the FBI. She'd known intellectually what Dante's world involved, but hearing it discussed so casually made it viscerally real in a way research and speculation never could. She should leave. Should back away quietly before they realized she was listening. But her feet stayed rooted to the floor, morbid curiosity overriding common sense. The situation is contained, Marcus said, his voice firm. The cleanup crew did their job. There's no evidence connecting us to Marco's departure. There better not be, Dante said, his tone carrying a weight that made Nora's skin crawl. Because if this blows back on us, if my name gets dragged into another investigation right now, everything we're trying to protect falls apart. Do you understand that? Yes, sir. Good. Then make sure our people know. No more bodies, no more public displays. I don't care how justified the hit is. We're under a microscope right now, and I can't afford any more attention. A pause. How are the cousins taking the news about the marriage? Not well, Marcus admitted. Vincent called it a desperate move. Luca's been making noise about challenging the legitimacy, claiming you married some nobody off the street just to meet the deadline. Let them make noise, Dante said, something cold and satisfied entering his voice. They had 6 months to make their move, and they wasted it assuming I'd die or stay broken. Now I have a wife, I meet the trust requirements, and they can't do a damn thing about it. Tell Vincent and Luca they're welcome to attend the reception if they want to congratulate me in person. Marcus chuckled, the sound devoid of warmth. That should be entertaining. It will be, Dante agreed. Now get out. I have calls to make. Nora heard movement and barely managed to duck into a nearby alcove before Marcus emerged, a man in his 50s, built like a boxer, with eyes that missed nothing. He walked past without seeing her, and Nora waited until his footsteps faded before letting out the breath she'd been holding. She should have known better than to think Dante's world was something she could observe from a safe distance. This wasn't a business arrangement with clean lines and legal protections. This was organized crime, violence, people disappearing into rivers because they'd crossed the wrong man, and she'd married into it. Nora made it back to her room and locked the door, her hands trembling. She pulled out her phone, stared at Patricia Chen's business card, and seriously considered calling the lawyer and asking if there was a way out of this contract that didn't involve breaking her grandmother's heart or ending up in a river herself. But she'd taken the money. The surgery was done. Her grandmother was recovering. There was no walking away now, not without consequences she couldn't afford. A soft knock on her door made Nora jump. She waited, barely breathing, until Julian's voice came through the wood. Mrs. Moretti, there's a package for you, from the stylist. May I leave it outside your door? Nora opened the door a crack. Julian stood there with several large shopping bags, his expression pleasant and unrevealing as always. The reception is in 3 days, he said, handing over the bags. Your gown is being altered, but these are some basics to get you started. Mrs. Castellano will go over the guest list with you tomorrow. Reception? Nora repeated blankly. The wedding reception, Julian clarified. Didn't Mr. Moretti mention it? It's standard. The ceremony was private, but the family expects a formal celebration. It's how these things are done. Of course, because nothing about this arrangement could be simple. How many people? Nora asked, already dreading the answer. 200 guests, give or take. Family, business associates, key allies. Think of it as your introduction to Dante's world. Julian's smile was almost sympathetic. Don't worry, you'll have plenty of coaching beforehand. Just smile, look devoted, and let Dante handle the politics. After he left, Nora opened the bags to find designer clothes with price tags that made her nauseated. Dresses, shoes, accessories, all in her size, all perfectly chosen for someone playing the role of mafia wife. She hung everything in the closet and tried not to think about the fact that she was being dressed like a doll for a performance she had no idea how to give. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Nora lay in the enormous bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling around her. Somewhere in the West Wing, Dante was probably awake too, planning strategy, making calls, running an empire from a wheelchair because he refused to let his injury be the thing that destroyed him. She didn't want to admire him for that. Didn't want to feel anything but professional detachment toward a man who'd made it clear she was just a convenient solution to an inconvenient problem. But somewhere between the physical therapy session and the conversation about bodies in rivers, Nora had started to see Dante Moretti as something more complicated than the cold criminal kingpin she'd expected. He was ruthless, yes, dangerous, absolutely. But he was also fighting a war on multiple fronts, against his own body, against rivals who wanted him dead, against time running out on keeping his empire intact. And for reasons Nora couldn't quite explain, she found herself wondering what it would take to help him win. The thought was dangerous. Getting invested in Dante's struggles, in his recovery, in anything beyond the transactional nature of their arrangement would only make the eventual separation harder. But as Nora finally drifted off to sleep, she couldn't quite shake the image of Dante on those parallel bars, shaking with exhaustion, refusing to quit. That kind of determination was either going to save him or destroy him. And Nora was starting to suspect she'd be there to witness whichever ending came first. The 3 days before the reception passed in a blur of preparation that felt more like combat training than wedding planning. Mrs. Castellano appeared at Nora's door each morning with schedules, lists, and expectations delivered in clipped sentences that left no room for negotiation. There were fittings for the gown, a stunning ivory creation that probably cost more than Nora's entire nursing school tuition, lessons on which fork to use at formal dinners, briefings on key family members and their various allegiances, and endless coaching on how to stand, smile, and play the role of devoted wife to a man she'd barely spoken to since their argument in the therapy room. Dante himself remained conspicuously absent from these preparations. Nora caught glimpses of him occasionally, being wheeled toward his office by Marcus, emerging from the therapy room with Dr. Ross, taking calls in the library with the door half open, but he never acknowledged her presence, and she didn't push for conversation. The distance suited them both, or at least that's what Nora told herself. On the second day, Julian summoned her to his office, a sleek space on the second floor that overlooked the gardens. He gestured for her to sit, then slid a thick folder across the desk. "The guest list," he explained. "I need you to familiarize yourself with the major players. Names, faces, relationships. You don't need to memorize everyone, but the key figures are marked with red tabs." Nora opened the folder to find photographs and brief biographies of what looked like half the criminal underworld of the Eastern Seaboard. Vincent Moretti, Dante's cousin, described as ambitious, calculating, currently managing the construction division. Luca Moretti, another cousin, younger, with a reputation for violence and a grudge against Dante that apparently predated the injury. There were business associates with legitimate-sounding titles that probably concealed illegal operations, family friends whose loyalty was noted as questionable, and several politicians whose presence on the guest list made Nora's stomach turn. "These people will be watching you," Julian said, his voice matter-of-fact, "looking for weakness, for cracks in the story, for any sign that this marriage isn't legitimate. Your job is to give them nothing. You're in love with your husband. You chose this life. You belong here. Can you do that?" Nora looked up from a photo of Vincent Moretti, handsome in a polished, predatory way that reminded her uncomfortably of a younger version of Dante. "Do I have a choice?" "Not really," Julian said with a slight smile. "But I found that asking helps people feel empowered." "How thoughtful of you." "I try." Julian leaned back in his chair, studying her with that clinical assessment that made Nora feel like a specimen being evaluated for quality. "You're doing better than I expected, you know. Most people would have run screaming by now, or at least cried." "I'm saving that for after I get paid," Nora said dryly. Julian's smile widened into something almost genuine. "You might actually survive this. Just remember, at the reception, you're not Nora Bennett, struggling nursing student. You're Mrs. Dante Moretti, and that means something in this world. Power, protection, fear. People will treat you differently because of whose name you carry. Don't let it go to your head, but don't be afraid to use it either." The thought of wielding power by association felt absurd, but Nora nodded anyway. She spent the rest of the afternoon memorizing faces and names, building a mental map of Dante's world that was equal parts fascinating and terrifying. That evening, she found Dante in the library, his wheelchair positioned by the window, a glass of something amber-colored in his hand. He didn't turn when she entered, but his shoulders tensed slightly, acknowledging her presence. "Julian says I need to know the story," Nora said, staying near the doorway. "How we met. How this happened. People are going to ask, and we need our answers to match." Dante took a slow sip of his drink before responding. "We met at a charity gala 6 months ago. You were volunteering, I was attending. We talked, exchanged numbers, started seeing each other quietly. After my injury, you stood by me when most people would have run. That devotion convinced me you were someone I could trust, someone I wanted to build a life with. We married quickly because I don't believe in wasting time, and neither do you. Simple, believable, hard to disprove." The story was smooth, well-constructed, probably crafted by Julian with input from whatever team Dante employed to manage his public image. It almost sounded real, which Nora supposed was the point. "What if someone asks about my family? My background?" Nora moved further into the room, drawn despite herself. "Your parents died when you were young. Your grandmother raised you. You're putting yourself through nursing school because you believe in helping people. All true, which makes it easier to remember." Dante finally turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the low light. You're not ashamed of where you come from, but you're also not naive enough to broadcast details that could be used against you. If people push, you smile and redirect. You've watched me do it 100 times by now. Nora hadn't realized he'd noticed her watching him during his calls, his meetings with Marcus and Julian. She filed that observation away for later consideration. And us? She asked. How do we act around each other? Like we're in love, Dante said flatly. Like you're the reason I'm fighting to recover. Like I'd burn down the world for you if someone threatened you. Can you manage that? The question should have been insulting, but something in Dante's voice suggested he genuinely wasn't sure, as if the idea of someone caring enough to fake devotion convincingly was foreign to his experience. I can manage, Nora said quietly. Can you? Dante's jaw tightened. He set his glass down with deliberate care, then wheeled himself closer, stopping just a few feet from where Nora stood. This close, she could see the exhaustion in his face, the pain he carried like a second skin, the fury that never quite left his eyes. I've been pretending to be things I'm not, since before you were born, he said, his voice low and edged with something dangerous. One more performance won't kill me. That's not what I asked. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the air between them charged with tension that had nothing to do with their arrangement and everything to do with the fact that they were two people trapped in an impossible situation, both drowning in different ways. Tomorrow night, Dante said finally, breaking eye contact, we'll do a practice run. Dinner, just us, in the formal dining room. We need to get comfortable being in the same space, touching, talking like we actually know each other. Julian will observe, give notes. Think of it as rehearsal. Romantic, Nora said, unable to keep the sarcasm from her voice. Romance is for people who have the luxury of choice, Dante replied. We're survivors. We do what's necessary. He wheeled past her toward the door, then paused, his back to her. For what it's worth, I don't enjoy this either. Making you play a role, dragging you into my world, putting you at risk just by association. But I won't apologize for it because we both knew what we were signing up for. Did we? Nora asked softly. I'm not sure either of us really understood what this would cost. Dante was silent for a beat too long. Then he moved forward without responding, leaving Nora alone in the library with the ghosts of whatever he'd been about to say. The practice dinner the following evening was exactly as awkward as Nora had anticipated. The formal dining room was absurdly large for two people, the table stretching between them like a physical manifestation of the distance they were supposed to pretend didn't exist. Julian sat off to the side, notepad in hand, observing with the detached interest of a director watching actors fumble through a difficult scene. You're sitting too far apart, he noted as the first course was served by staff, who'd been instructed to act as if this was a normal evening. Scoot closer, Nora. This is supposed to be intimate. Nora moved her chair, closing some of the distance. Dante's expression remained carefully neutral, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was as uncomfortable with this charade as she was. Better, Julian said. Now, conversation. Dante, tell Nora about your day. Nora, act interested. I am capable of being interested without acting, Nora said, her tone sharper than intended. Prove it, Dante said, something almost like amusement flickering across his face. My day was meetings, physical therapy, and arguing with my accountant about revenue projections. Fascinating stuff. How was therapy? Nora asked, ignoring Julian's presence, focusing on Dante. Did you make progress? Something shifted in Dante's expression. Surprised, maybe, that she'd asked about the one thing that mattered rather than making polite small talk about nothing. Dr. Ross says I'm ahead of schedule. I can stand for almost 5 minutes now without support. Another month and I might manage the walker he keeps pushing on me. That's good, Nora said, and meant it. Really good. Touch, Julian interjected. You've been married for days. You should be comfortable with physical contact. Nora reached across the table, resting her hand over Dante's. His skin was warm, his fingers surprisingly elegant for someone who'd probably done terrible things with those hands. He didn't pull away, but she felt the tension in him, the instinctive resistance to vulnerability. Like this? She asked Julian, not looking away from Dante. Exactly like that, Julian said, making a note. Hold it. Get used to the feel of each other. Tomorrow night, everyone will be watching to see if this looks real." They sat like that through the rest of the meal, hands connected across expensive china and crystal, two strangers playing at intimacy while a man with a notepad critiqued their performance. It should have been ridiculous. Instead, it felt strangely significant, like they were building something fragile and potentially important out of pure necessity. "Tell me something real," Dante said suddenly, his voice low enough that Julian had to strain to hear. "Something not in the contract or the backstory, something true." Nora considered lying, keeping her walls up, maintaining the professional distance that was supposed to protect them both. But there was something in Dante's eyes, a desperate kind of curiosity maybe, or a need to connect with something genuine in a world built on deception. "I'm terrified," she admitted quietly, "of tomorrow, of your family, of messing this up, and somehow making things worse for both of us. I keep thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, and I don't know how to make my brain stop spinning worst-case scenarios." Dante's hand turned beneath hers, his fingers curling around her palm in what might have been reassurance or just a better grip. "I'm terrified too," he said, the confession clearly costing him something. "Not of my family, they're predictable, but of being stuck like this, of fighting so hard to recover and still ending up broken, of building everything back just to watch it collapse again." "That's enough truth for one evening," Julian said, his voice gentler than usual. "You're doing well. Tomorrow, just remember this feeling, the honesty. That's what sells a relationship, not the grand gestures, but the small moments of real connection." After dinner, Nora walked Dante back to his wing of the house, the silence between them more comfortable than it had been before. At the door to his rooms, he paused, looking up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," he said abruptly, "for not treating this like a joke, for taking it seriously." "It is serious," Nora replied. "For both of us. We're in this together, whether we like it or not." "Together," Dante repeated, as if testing the word. "I'm not very good at that. The together part." "Neither am I," Nora admitted, "so I guess we'll figure it out as we go." She thought he might say something else, but instead he just nodded and disappeared through the doorway, leaving Nora in the hallway with the unsettling realization that she was starting to care whether Dante Moretti succeeded or failed. Not just because her payment depended on it, but because somewhere beneath the dangerous exterior was a man fighting desperately to reclaim his life. The morning of the reception arrived with perfect spring weather, as if even nature had been paid to cooperate. Nora woke to find her room transformed into a staging area, makeup artists, hairstylists, Mrs. Castellano directing traffic with military precision, and the gown hanging like a promise or a threat depending on how she looked at it. The transformation took 3 hours. Nora sat still while strangers painted her face, styled her hair into something elegant and unfamiliar, and discussed her like she wasn't in the room. When they finally let her look in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman staring back looked sophisticated, polished, expensive, everything Nora had never been and wasn't sure she wanted to become. "Mrs. Moretti," one of the stylists breathed, her voice full of satisfaction. "You look perfect." Perfect for what? Nora wanted to ask, but didn't. She knew the answer. Perfect for playing a role. Perfect for standing beside Dante and convincing 200 criminals and power brokers that this marriage was real. The gown fit like it had been designed specifically for her body, which it probably had been. Ivory silk that caught the light, elegant without being ostentatious, expensive without screaming wealth. Nora slipped on the shoes, heels that added 3 inches she didn't need, and took a breath that didn't quite fill her lungs. Mrs. Castellano appeared in the doorway, her usual stern expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Moretti is waiting in the foyer. Are you ready?" "No," Nora thought. Out loud, she said, "Yes." The walk down to the foyer felt like descending toward an execution. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands were cold despite the warmth of the house. And the rational part of her brain kept screaming that this was insane, that she should run, that nothing good could come from walking deeper into Dante Moretti's dangerous world. But then she reached the bottom of the stairs and saw him waiting, and every thought in her head went silent. Dante had traded the wheelchair for a walker. He stood, actually stood, his weight supported by the metal frame, his legs shaking with the effort but holding, dressed in a tuxedo that probably cost more than a used car. His dark hair was styled back, his jaw freshly shaved, and when he looked up and saw her descending the stairs, the expression that crossed his face was so raw, so unguarded, that Nora forgot to breathe. "You look," Dante started, then stopped, as if the words he needed didn't exist in any language he spoke. "So do you," Nora managed, reaching the bottom step. "You're standing. For you," he said, his voice rough with pain and determination. "I'm standing for you." It was a performance, Nora reminded herself. A calculated gesture designed to send a message to the guests who would arrive soon. Dante Moretti wasn't broken. He was recovering, fighting, still dangerous despite the injury. And he had a wife worth standing for. But the way he looked at her, like she was something precious and terrifying all at once, felt real in a way that made Nora's carefully constructed emotional walls crack just a little. "How long can you hold it?" she asked quietly, moving closer. "Long enough," Dante said through gritted teeth. "When we greet guests, when we do the first dance, when it matters most. Dr. Ross is on standby with the wheelchair for when I can't anymore. But tonight, I walk, even if it kills me." "It might," Nora said, genuine concern bleeding through. "Then I'll die on my feet instead of sitting down," Dante replied. And there was such fierce pride in his voice that Nora understood this wasn't about impressing guests or maintaining appearances. This was about Dante proving to himself that he was still the man he'd been before someone put bullets in his spine. Julian appeared, impeccable as always, his expression betraying nothing as he took in the scene. "The guests are beginning to arrive. Are we ready?" Dante held out one hand to Nora, his grip on the walker white-knuckled with the other. "Ready?" Nora took his hand, feeling the tremor in his fingers, the cost of this gesture written in every line of his body. "Ready." The reception was held in the estate's ballroom, a space Nora hadn't even known existed until that morning. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking gardens lit with thousands of tiny lights. It looked like something from a movie, beautiful and surreal, and filled with the most dangerous people Nora had never wanted to meet. They positioned themselves at the entrance, Dante leaning heavily on his walker, Nora at his side, presenting a united front as guests began to filter through. Each introduction was a performance. Smiles, handshakes, Dante's hand finding Nora's waist in a gesture of possession that made several guests raise eyebrows in surprise. Vincent Moretti arrived with an entourage, his smile sharp as broken glass. "Cousin," he said, his eyes moving between Dante and Nora with undisguised assessment. "Congratulations on your marriage, and on your remarkable recovery. We'd heard you were confined to a wheelchair." "You heard wrong," Dante said easily, his voice carrying a warning beneath the pleasant tone. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, and this is my wife, Nora." Vincent took Nora's hand, his grip just a touch too firm. "Charming. Tell me, Mrs. Moretti, what made you fall for my cousin? His winning personality or his extensive business interests?" The question was designed to rattle her, to expose her as the fraud she was. Nora met Vincent's eyes directly, channeling every ounce of defiance she possessed. "I fell for the man who fought his way back from the edge of death, because he refused to give up. Everything else is just details." Something flickered in Vincent's expression. Respect, maybe, or recalculation. "How poetic," he murmured, releasing her hand. "I look forward to getting to know you better." After he moved on, Dante's hand tightened on Nora's waist. "Well done," he said quietly. "Vincent respects strength. You just earned his attention, which is both good and dangerous." "Story of my life lately," Nora muttered, and felt rather than heard Dante's low laugh. Luca Moretti was younger, brasher, his handshake aggressive, and his eyes openly hostile. "So this is the nobody you married to keep control," he said, not bothering with pretense. "Did cousin Dante tell you what he's really like, what he's done? Or did he just wave money in your face and hope you wouldn't ask questions?" "Luca," Dante said, his voice dropping to something cold and final. "Behave or leave. Your choice." "I'm just being honest," Luca said, his smile vicious. "Someone should tell your pretty wife what she's signed up for. Unless she already knows. Maybe she's not as innocent as she looks." Nora felt Dante tense beside her, felt the violence coiling in him like a spring wound too tight. Before he could do something that would turn the reception into a crime scene, She stepped forward, putting herself between the cousins. "I know exactly what I signed up for," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "And I choose to be here. If that bothers you, Luca, you're welcome to leave. Otherwise, show some respect for your cousin's wife." For a heartbeat, she thought Luca might actually take a swing at her. Then he laughed, the sound ugly and sharp. "She's got spine. I'll give you that, Dante. Maybe she'll last longer than the last one." He walked away before either of them could respond, leaving a tension in his wake that made several nearby guests shift uncomfortably. "What happened to the last one?" Nora asked quietly. "Later," Dante said, his jaw tight. "Not here." The evening progressed in waves of introductions, conversations, and careful political navigation. Nora smiled until her face hurt, made small talk about nothing, and played the role of devoted wife, while Dante stood beside her, his body slowly failing despite his desperate determination to appear strong. By the time dinner was announced, Dante was gray with pain, his grip on the walker so tight Nora worried he might actually break the metal. She caught Dr. Ross's eye across the room, saw the physician's concerned expression, and made a decision. "You need to sit," she said quietly to Dante. "Not yet," he ground out. "The first dance! I'm doing the first dance!" "Dante, no." His eyes met hers, and the desperation there was almost painful to witness. "I need this, Nora. I need everyone in this room to see that I'm still standing, still fighting, still in control. After the dance, I'll sit. I promise." The first dance was announced as the main course was being cleared. A small orchestra positioned in the corner began playing something slow and elegant, and 200 pairs of eyes turned toward Dante and Nora as they made their way to the center of the ballroom. Dante abandoned the walker at the edge of the dance floor, transferring his weight to Nora with a trust that felt monumental. She wrapped one arm around his waist, feeling the tremor in his muscles, the way his legs barely supported his weight. His hand found hers, his other arm settling on her shoulder, and together they began to move. It wasn't really dancing. It was Dante using every ounce of strength he possessed to stay upright, while Nora essentially held him, their movements minimal, their bodies pressed together out of necessity rather than romance. But to the watching guests, it looked like intimacy. It looked like a man so in love with his wife that he'd force his broken body to dance with her, and a woman who loved him enough to hold him through it. "I've got you," Nora whispered, her lips close to his ear. "Just breathe. I've got you." "I know," Dante said, and there was something in his voice, gratitude maybe, or wonder, that made Nora's breath catch. "I know you do." They swayed together through the entire song, Dante's weight growing heavier with each passing second, his breath coming in short, pained gasps that he tried desperately to hide. When the music finally ended, the room erupted in polite applause, and Nora felt Dante's legs start to give out. Dr. Ross materialized with the wheelchair as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. Dante collapsed into it with a grace that suggested he'd practiced this particular defeat, and Nora knelt beside him, her hand finding his, maintaining the image of concern and devotion that wasn't entirely performance anymore. "You did it," she said softly. "You stood for me, you danced with me, and everyone saw exactly what you wanted them to see." Dante's hand squeezed hers, his expression exhausted but somehow triumphant. "We did it," he corrected. "Together." The rest of the reception passed in a blur. Nora stayed close to Dante, fielding questions, deflecting when necessary, and slowly beginning to understand the intricate web of alliances and enmities that made up his world. People treated her differently after the dance, with more respect, more curiosity, as if she'd proven herself worthy of the Moretti name by holding Dante upright through a 3-minute waltz. It was well past midnight when the last guests finally left. Nora's feet ached from the heels, her face hurt from smiling, and her head spun with names and faces and political calculations she was still trying to process. Dante looked like he might pass out at any moment, the toll of the evening written in every line of his body. "You should rest," Nora said as they made their way back toward the residential wing, the house finally quiet around them. "I should," Dante agreed, but made no move to leave. Instead, he wheeled himself to a stop, looking up at Nora with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Thank you. For tonight. For playing your part so well. For—" He hesitated, then continued, "for not letting me fall." You wouldn't have fallen, Nora said, the truth of it settling in her bones. You're too stubborn. Maybe, Dante said. Or maybe I just had something worth staying upright for. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. Before Nora could respond, Dante turned his wheelchair toward his wing of the house. "Good night, Mrs. Moretti," he said, his voice carrying the ghost of something that might have been affection. "Good night," Nora replied, watching him disappear into the shadows. She stood alone in the empty hallway, still wearing the ivory gown, still playing a role that was becoming harder to distinguish from reality. Somewhere between the practice dinner and the first dance, between Dante's desperate struggle to stand and the way he'd looked at her like she was the only real thing in his carefully constructed world, the lines had started to blur. This was supposed to be temporary. A transaction, 6 months and done. But as Nora finally made her way back to her own room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted tonight. That the performance had become something else entirely, something dangerous and complicated and potentially devastating. She'd married Dante Moretti to save her grandmother. But somewhere along the way, she'd started caring whether he saved himself. And that Nora realized as she finally slipped out of the expensive gown and into her own clothes was the most dangerous thing of all. The weeks following the reception settled into something that almost resembled normalcy. If normal included living in a mansion with armed security and being married to a man who ran a criminal empire from a wheelchair, Nora found herself falling into patterns she hadn't anticipated. Breakfast in the sunroom while Dante worked through emails on his tablet. Afternoons at the hospital with her grandmother followed by quiet dinners where she and Dante actually talked about things that mattered. Evenings spent reading in the library while he took calls that she'd learned not to listen too closely to. Her grandmother was thriving, the transplant a complete success, her color returning along with her energy. She asked fewer questions about the mysterious scholarship now, too focused on her recovery and planning what she'd do once she was released. Nora let her plan, let her dream, and swallowed the guilt that came with lying to the one person who'd never lied to her. But it was worth it. Every time Nora saw her grandmother smile without pain shadowing her eyes, every time she heard her laugh at something one of the nurses said, the guilt became easier to bear. This was why she'd agreed to the arrangement. This was what mattered. What she hadn't expected was how much the rest of it would start to matter too. Dante had been different since the reception. Not softer exactly. He was still demanding, still controlled every detail of his world with an iron fist, still capable of cold fury when things didn't go according to plan. But with Nora, something had shifted. He sought her out now, seemed to actually want her company rather than just tolerating her presence. They'd started having breakfast together deliberately instead of by accident, and their conversations had evolved beyond surface pleasantries into something that felt almost like friendship. Almost, because friendship didn't quite capture the tension that hummed between them whenever they were in the same room. The awareness that came with accidental touches, the way Dante's eyes tracked her movements when he thought she wasn't looking, the moments when Nora caught herself wondering what it would be like if their arrangement was real instead of purchased. It was dangerous territory, and Nora knew it. But knowing and caring enough to stop were two different things. She was in the library one afternoon, supposedly studying for her nursing classes, but actually staring out the window at the gardens when Dante wheeled himself in. He'd been using the wheelchair more lately, Dr. Ross having warned that pushing too hard would damage his recovery rather than accelerate it. Dante had fought the logic, but eventually conceded, though Nora could tell it cost him something every time he had to sit down instead of stand. "You're avoiding your textbooks," he observed, positioning himself near her chair. "I'm taking a mental break," Nora corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Dante's tone was amused rather than critical. "What's the break for? Too much information about kidney function?" "Actually, yes." Nora closed the book, grateful for the interruption. "I can diagram the entire nephron in my sleep at this point. Any more, and I'll start seeing them when I blink." Dante smiled, a real smile, not the sharp, dangerous expression he wore for the rest of the world. "Come with me. I want to show you something." Nora followed him through the house to a part of the estate she hadn't explored yet, a converted greenhouse that had been transformed into something between a garden and a sanctuary. Glass walls let in afternoon light, illuminating plants Nora couldn't identify, and a small fountain in the center that filled the space with the gentle sound of running water. "I didn't know this was here," Nora said, genuinely surprised. Not many people do, Dante replied, wheeling himself along a path between raised garden beds. My mother designed this space. Before she died, she spent hours here, said it was the only place she could think clearly. After the funeral, my father locked it up, said it hurt too much to see it without her. I had it reopened after the injury, thought maybe I'd understand what she meant about clarity. It was the most personal thing Dante had shared since their marriage, and Nora handled it carefully, sensing the weight of what he was offering. Did you? Understand, I mean? Sometimes. Dante stopped near the fountain, his expression distant. When the pain gets bad, or the therapy feels impossible, or I catch myself wondering if I'll ever really recover, I come here. Sit with the quiet. Try to remember that my mother survived worse than this and still managed to find beauty in the world. What happened to her? Nora asked softly, sitting on the bench beside his wheelchair. Cancer, ovarian. By the time they caught it, there was nothing anyone could do. Dante's voice was carefully controlled, but Nora heard the old grief beneath it. She lasted 8 months, fought every single day. Near the end, when the pain was unbearable, she told me that strength wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to let the fight turn you into something you weren't. Said the real victory was staying human even when everything in you wanted to become a monster. Did you listen? Nora asked, already knowing the answer. Dante's laugh was bitter. No, I became exactly the monster she warned me not to be. Built an empire on fear and violence, made choices that would have broken her heart, convinced myself that power was the same thing as strength. And then someone put 3 bullets in my back, and I woke up paralyzed, finally understanding what she meant. That all my power, all my control, all the fear I'd cultivated, none of it mattered when I couldn't even stand up on my own. The vulnerability in his words made Nora's chest ache. She reached for his hand without thinking, her fingers curling around his. You're not a monster, Dante. You don't know what I've done, he said quietly, not pulling away from her touch. The people I've hurt, the orders I've given, the blood on my hands that won't ever wash clean. Maybe not, Nora agreed, but I know what you're doing now, fighting to recover, trying to hold your empire together without resorting to the violence you used to depend on, building something different. That counts for something. Dante looked at her then, really looked at her, and the intensity in his eyes made Nora's breath catch. Why are you really here, Nora? And don't say it's just about the money. I see how you look at me sometimes, like you're trying to solve a puzzle. What are you looking for? The question caught Nora off guard, stripped away the easy answers she'd prepared. She could lie, could deflect, could maintain the professional distance that was supposed to protect them both. But sitting in his mother's greenhouse, surrounded by beauty that had survived grief and abandonment, honesty felt like the only option. I'm looking for proof that people can change, she said finally. That making one desperate choice doesn't define your entire life. That you can start from a terrible place and still end up somewhere good. Because if you can do it, if someone like you can transform into someone better, then maybe I can too. You don't need to change, Dante said, his voice rough. He stopped, seemed to struggle for words. You're the first real thing that's happened to me in years. Everyone else wants something, plays an angle, performs for advantage. But you look at me like I'm just a man. Not a boss, not a threat, not an opportunity. Just someone trying not to drown. Isn't that what you are? Nora asked softly. I used to know, Dante admitted. Now I'm not sure anymore. They sat in silence after that, hands still joined, the fountain providing a gentle soundtrack to thoughts neither of them was ready to voice. Nora understood that something was shifting between them, that the careful boundaries they'd maintained were eroding with each shared moment. She should pull back, should remember that this was temporary, that in less than 5 months they'd go their separate ways and pretend this marriage had never been real. But she didn't want to pull back, didn't want to pretend. And that terrified her more than anything in Dante's dangerous world ever could. The moment broke when Dante's phone buzzed with a message. He glanced at it, and whatever he saw made his expression shutter closed, the vulnerable man disappearing behind the cold businessman. I have to take this, he said, releasing Nora's hand. Julian needs me in my office. He wheeled himself away before she could respond. leaving Nora alone in the greenhouse with the unsettling realization that she was falling for her temporary husband. Not because of his power or his money or the role he played in her survival, but because underneath all the violence and control was someone fighting desperately to become better than he'd been. Someone who trusted her enough to show her his mother's sanctuary and admit he didn't have all the answers. Someone she could actually love if she let herself. Nora stayed in the greenhouse for another hour, trying to talk herself out of feelings that had no place in a contract marriage. By the time she returned to the main house, she'd almost convinced herself that what she felt was gratitude and proximity, nothing more. Then she saw the woman waiting in the foyer, and every carefully constructed rationalization crumbled. She was beautiful in a way that made Nora feel instantly inadequate. Tall, elegant, with the kind of bone structure that belonged on magazine covers, and the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. She wore a designer suit that probably cost more than Nora's car. Her dark hair swept into a flawless chignon, her makeup subtle and perfect, and she was staring at Nora like she was something scraped off an expensive shoe. "You must be the replacement," the woman said, her voice cultured and cold. "How quaint." Nora's spine straightened. "I'm Nora Moretti. And you are?" "Isabella Marchesi." The woman's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Dante's former fiancé." "I'm here to speak with him about a business matter. Where is he?" The words hit like a physical blow. Former fiancé. Dante had mentioned an engagement that ended after the injury, but he'd made it sound like ancient history, not something that could walk through his front door demanding an audience. "He's in a meeting," Nora said, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden sick feeling in her stomach. "I can let him know you're here." "Don't bother." Isabella moved past Nora like she owned the place, her heels clicking against marble with familiar confidence. "I know where his office is. We were engaged for 2 years. This house used to be as much mine as his." Mrs. Castellano appeared from a side hallway, her expression revealing nothing. "Miss Marchesi, Mr. Moretti isn't expecting you." "He'll see me," Isabella said with absolute certainty. "We have unfinished business." She disappeared down the hallway before anyone could stop her, leaving Nora standing in the foyer with a growing sense of dread. Mrs. Castellano's expression softened slightly, the closest she'd come to sympathy since Nora had arrived. "Don't let her get to you," the older woman said quietly. "Miss Marchesi has always been good at making people feel small. It's her particular talent." "What happened between them?" Nora asked, hating how much she needed to know. "Mrs. Oz." Castellano hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. They were engaged before the injury. Miss Marchesi came from the right family, had the right connections, knew how to navigate this world. Mr. Moretti thought she was perfect for his life. Then he got shot, ended up in a wheelchair, and Miss Marchesi couldn't handle being engaged to someone who looked weak. She broke it off 3 months into his recovery, cited irreconcilable differences in the paperwork. Broke his heart, though he'd never admit it. The revelation made too many things click into place. Dante's walls, his certainty that their marriage was just business, his determination to stand at the reception despite the cost. He was proving he wasn't the broken man Isabella had abandoned. He was showing everyone, but especially her, that he was still formidable. Nora should have felt vindicated, should have been glad that Dante's emotional distance had a source that had nothing to do with her. Instead, she felt fury building in her chest, white-hot and protective, directed at a woman who'd looked at Dante's injury and seen only weakness. She was halfway to Dante's office before she realized she was moving, driven by something that felt a lot like possessiveness, and nothing like the professional detachment she was supposed to maintain. The door was partially open, and voices carried into the hallway. Dante's, controlled and cold, and Isabella's, sharp with something that might have been desperation or calculation. "Ridiculous, Dante. You married some nobody to meet the trust deadline? Do you have any idea how that looks?" "It looks like I'm in control of my life and my business," Dante replied, his voice dangerously calm. "Something you made very clear you wanted no part of when I was at my weakest." "I made a mistake." Isabella's voice shifted, took on a pleading quality that sounded calculated. "I was scared, overwhelmed by everything that happened. But I've had time to think, to realize what I gave up. We were good together, Dante. We could be again." "We were never good together," Dante said flatly. "We were convenient. You wanted access to my world. I wanted someone who understood it. But the moment that became inconvenient, the moment you had to actually stand by me instead of just standing next to me, you ran. So no, Isabella, we're done. We were done the day you walked out of the hospital. And her? Isabella's voice turned sharp again. This nurse you pulled off the street and married in a courthouse? You expect me to believe that's real? That you fell in love with some girl who probably didn't even know your name 3 months ago? Nora should have left then, should have walked away before she heard Dante's answer, but she stayed, frozen in the hallway, desperately needing to know what he'd say. The silence stretched too long. Then Dante spoke, his voice different than Nora had ever heard it, uncertain, searching, almost vulnerable. I don't know what it is, he admitted, but it's more real than anything I had with you. Nora looks at me and sees a person, not a position. She held me up when I could barely stand, not because she was paid to, but because she chose to. She sits with me in my mother's greenhouse and doesn't flinch when I tell her about the monster I used to be. So no, Isabella, I don't expect you to believe it's real. I barely believe it myself, but it's mine, and you have no place in it. Nora's hand flew to her mouth, stifling the sound that wanted to escape. Through the crack in the door, she saw Isabella's face twist with fury, and something that looked like genuine pain. You're making a mistake, Isabella said, her voice cold again. She doesn't belong in this world. She'll crack under the pressure. Or worse, she'll get herself killed because she doesn't understand the rules. And when that happens, don't come crying to me. I won't need to, Dante said. Because unlike you, Nora is stronger than she looks. Now get out of my house, Isabella. We have nothing left to say to each other. Nora heard movement and barely managed to duck into a side room before Isabella stormed past, her face a mask of barely controlled rage. After her heels faded down the hallway, after the front door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows, Nora emerged from hiding and found herself face to face with Julian, who'd appeared from somewhere with his usual impeccable timing. Eavesdropping, Mrs. Moretti? He asked, one eyebrow raised. Learning about my husband's past, Nora corrected, lifting her chin. There's a difference. Is there? Julian's expression was amused. For what it's worth, everything Dante told her was true. Isabella was never right for him. Too focused on image, not enough substance. You, on the other hand. He paused, studying Nora with that clinical assessment she'd never quite gotten used to. You might actually be exactly what he needs, even if neither of you planned it that way. This is temporary, Nora said, more to convince herself than Julian. In 4 months, we go our separate ways. Do you really believe that? Julian asked softly. Because I've known Dante for 15 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Not Isabella, not anyone. Whatever this started as, it's not that anymore. He walked away before Nora could respond, leaving her standing in the hallway with her heart racing and her carefully maintained emotional distance in ruins. She should go to Dante, should talk about what just happened, should address the impossible thing growing between them. Instead, she went to her room, locked the door, and tried to figure out when exactly she'd stopped playing a role and started living a life she couldn't afford to want. That night, sleep eluded her completely. Nora lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying Dante's words to Isabella over and over. More real than anything I had with you. She sees a person, not a position. It's mine, and you have no place in it. He defended their marriage like it mattered, like she mattered, not as a convenient solution to an inheritance problem, but as someone worth fighting for. The realization was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Around 2 a.m, Nora gave up on sleep and wandered down to the kitchen, hoping tea and distraction might quiet her spinning thoughts. She found Dante there instead, silhouetted against the windows in his wheelchair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and exhaustion written in every line of his body. Can't sleep either? She asked quietly. Dante turned, and something in his expression made Nora's breath catch. I keep thinking about what Isabella said, that you don't belong here, that this world will destroy you. Do you believe that? Nora asked, moving closer. I don't know. Dante set down his glass, his eyes never leaving hers. I know I should. I know the smart thing would be to keep you at arm's length, maintain the distance, let you walk away clean when this is over. But I don't want to be smart anymore, Nora. I'm tired of calculating every relationship, every interaction, every moment. With you, He stopped, frustrated. I just want to be honest. Then be honest, Nora said, her heart hammering. Tell me what you want. I want you to stay. The words came out raw, unguarded. Not because of the contract or the money or the arrangement. I want you to stay because you choose to. Because this, whatever this is between us, is worth exploring. And I know that's selfish. I know I have no right to ask when you signed up for 6 months of pretending, but I'm asking anyway. Nora stood frozen, every rational argument against what he was proposing warring with the simple truth that she wanted the same thing. Wanted him, wanted this, wanted to see where honesty could take them when they stopped hiding behind contracts and performances. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. Scared of getting hurt, scared of falling for someone whose world involves bodies and rivers and armed guards and enemies who want him dead. Scared that this is just proximity and gratitude dressed up as something more. I'm scared too, Dante said, wheeling himself closer until he was right in front of her. Terrified, actually. But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe and alone anymore. So if you're willing to take the risk, if you're willing to see what this could be without the contracts and the timelines, I'm asking you to try. Nora looked down at him, at this man who'd fought his way back from the edge of death, who'd stood for her when standing was agony, who'd defended their marriage to his ex-fiancée like it was the most real thing in his life. She thought about the greenhouse, about shared breakfasts and quiet evenings, about all the small moments that had built something neither of them had planned for. She thought about walking away in 4 months, going back to her old life, pretending this had never happened. The idea made her chest ache with a loneliness she could already feel. Okay, she said softly. Let's try. Dante's expression transformed, relief and wonder, and something that looked a lot like hope. He reached for her hand, pulling her down until she was kneeling in front of his wheelchair, their faces level, their breath mingling in the small space between them. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. The real relationship part. I'm going to mess up, probably hurt you without meaning to, definitely make mistakes. Then we'll mess up together, Nora said, her hand cupping his face. And figure it out as we go. Dante leaned forward, closing the distance, and kissed her with a tenderness that made Nora's eyes burn with unshed tears. It wasn't the desperate kiss of people who'd been waiting too long, but something gentler, a promise, maybe, or the beginning of something neither of them knew how to name yet. When they finally pulled apart, Dante rested his forehead against hers, his hands framing her face like she was something precious. Stay tonight, he said quietly. Not in the East Wing, with me, just to sleep, nothing more. I don't want to be alone anymore. Nora nodded, beyond words, and let Dante lead her to his wing of the house, to rooms she'd never entered, to a bed they shared for the first time with nothing between them but honesty and the fragile beginning of something real. They fell asleep tangled together, Dante's arm around her waist, Nora's head on his shoulder, both of them surrendering to the truth they'd been fighting since the night they met. This wasn't temporary anymore. This wasn't a performance. This was real and terrifying, and possibly the best decision either of them had ever made. Outside, the estate settled into silence, security making their rounds, the world continuing to turn. Inside, two people who'd married for all the wrong reasons discovered they'd somehow found all the right ones along the way. And for the first time since the injury, since the bullets, and the betrayal, and the desperate scramble to maintain control, Dante Moretti slept without nightmares, anchored by the woman in his arms who'd chosen to stay. Morning arrived with sunlight streaming through windows Nora didn't recognize, and for a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then she felt the weight of Dante's arm across her waist, heard his steady breathing behind her, and reality settled back into place with startling clarity. She'd spent the night in Dante's bed. They'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, moved from performance into something genuine and potentially devastating. And instead of panicking, instead of retreating back to the safety of emotional distance, Nora felt something that might have been peace. Dante stirred behind her, his arm tightening slightly before he seemed to wake fully and remember where they were, what they'd decided in the quiet hours of the night. Morning, he said, his voice rough with sleep. Morning, Nora replied, turning to face him. In the early light, without the armor of his usual control, Dante looked younger, more vulnerable. almost like the man he might have been if life had been kinder. "Any regrets?" he asked, and beneath the casual tone was genuine uncertainty. "Not yet," Nora said honestly. "Ask me again when your world inevitably tries to destroy me." Dante's smile was crooked, almost boyish. "Fair enough. For what it's worth, I'll do my best to prevent the destroying part." "Your best better be very good," Nora said, but she was smiling too, and the tension that had defined their relationship for weeks was gone, replaced by something easier, warmer. They stayed in bed longer than they should have, talking quietly about nothing important, her classes, his physical therapy, Mrs. Castellano's barely concealed disapproval of everyone and everything. Normal conversation between two people learning how to be together without pretending. It felt revolutionary and ordinary all at once. The next 2 weeks unfolded with a sweetness Nora hadn't known she was capable of feeling. She and Dante stopped maintaining separate wings of the house, stopped pretending their marriage was purely transactional. They had breakfast together every morning, Dante sometimes cooking despite the difficulty of maneuvering his wheelchair around the kitchen, both of them laughing when he burned the eggs or she oversalted the coffee. They studied together in the evenings, Nora with her nursing texts, Dante with business reports. Their legs tangled together on the library sofa while music played softly in the background. Dante's recovery accelerated, Dr. Ross noting with professional satisfaction that his patient's improved mood was translating into better physical progress. He could stand for longer periods now, take steps with the walker that looked almost natural, and the pain that had been his constant companion was slowly receding. Nora's grandmother was released from the hospital, moving into a rehabilitation facility that felt more like a luxury resort than a medical center. She was thriving, her strength returning daily, and when Nora visited, she talked constantly about the future, the garden she'd plant, the volunteer work she wanted to resume, the joy of being given a second chance at life. "You look different," her grandmother observed one afternoon, studying Nora with the knowing eyes of someone who'd raised her from childhood. "Happy. Like something's finally going right." Nora felt the guilt rise, the weight of all the lies she'd told stacking up like debts she couldn't repay. But she pushed it down and smiled, because her grandmother was alive, healthy, talking about futures instead of saying goodbye. Whatever moral compromises Nora had made, whatever prices she'd paid, this moment made them worthwhile. "Things are good," Nora said, and it wasn't even a lie. Really good. She should have known it couldn't last. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Nora was studying in the greenhouse, and Dante was in a meeting with Marcus about shipment routes that Nora had learned not to ask too many questions about. Her phone buzzed with an unknown number, and something in her gut told her to answer. "Mrs. Moretti?" The voice was female, professional, unfamiliar. "My name is Catherine Reynolds. I'm a journalist with the Tribune. I'm working on a story about your husband's business operations, and I was hoping to ask you a few questions." Nora's blood went cold. "I don't have any comment about my husband's business." "That's understandable," Catherine said smoothly, "but I think you might want to hear what I've uncovered. It involves you directly, the circumstances of your marriage specifically. I have documents showing that you were paid to marry Mr. Moretti, that this entire relationship is a fabrication designed to circumvent inheritance laws. I'm running the story in 3 days unless you'd like to provide your side." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Nora gripped the phone so hard her knuckles went white. "Who told you that?" "A source close to the Moretti family. Someone with access to financial records and legal documents. Someone who's tired of watching Dante Moretti manipulate the system." Catherine paused. "I'm not trying to destroy you, Mrs. Moretti, but the public has a right to know when powerful men are committing fraud. If you cooperate, if you tell me the truth about what happened, I can frame the story in a way that's sympathetic to your situation. Otherwise, you're just going to look like a willing accomplice." "I need to think about this," Nora managed, her voice shaking. "You have 48 hours, Catherine said. After that, I publish what I have. My number's on your caller ID. Use it." The line went dead, leaving Nora sitting in her dead mother-in-law's greenhouse, with her heart racing and her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Someone had leaked their secret. Someone with access to the contract, to the financial records, to the truth they'd both worked so hard to hide. Someone who wanted to destroy Dante was willing to destroy her in the process. Nora found Dante in his office, Marcus standing over a series of maps spread across the desk, both men deep in conversation about territory disputes and profit margins. When Dante saw her face, whatever he saw there made him immediately dismiss Marcus. "What happened?" he asked, wheeling himself toward her as soon as they were alone. Nora told him about the call, watched his expression shift from concern to cold fury, saw the businessman replaced by the dangerous man she'd married and then somehow fallen in love with. "Who knows about the contract?" Nora asked. "Who has access?" "Julian, my lawyers, the trust administrators." Dante's jaw clenched. "And my cousin's legal team, because they challenged the marriage and demanded proof it was legitimate. We provided enough documentation to satisfy them without revealing the truth. But if someone dug deeper, if they had the right connections—" "Vincent," Nora said, the pieces clicking together. "Or Luca. They want you to fail, want control of the business. What better way than exposing the marriage as fraud?" "If this story runs, the trust will be invalidated," Dante said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Everything I've fought for, everything I've built, it all falls apart. The cousins take over, and I lose everything." "What about me?" Nora asked quietly. "What happens to me if this goes public?" Dante's expression cracked, fury giving way to something that looked like genuine anguish. "You get labeled a gold digger, maybe charged with fraud if the prosecutors decide to make an example. Your nursing license could be revoked before you even finish school. Your grandmother finds out you lied about everything. And it's my fault because I pulled you into this world without thinking about what would happen when it inevitably exploded." The weight of potential consequences settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Nora had known, intellectually, that there were risks involved in their arrangement, but she'd convinced herself that they were smart enough, careful enough, lucky enough to avoid disaster. She'd been wrong. "We need to figure out who leaked this and shut them down before the story runs," Dante said, already pulling out his phone. "Julian can handle the journalist, offer her something better, threaten legal action, whatever it takes. But we need to plug the leak first." Over the next 24 hours, the estate transformed into something between a war room and a fortress. Julian worked his connections, trying to identify the source while simultaneously building a case against the journalist for invasion of privacy, defamation, anything that might delay publication. Marcus increased security, brought in additional guards, and quietly reached out to contacts in Vincent and Luca's operations to gather intelligence. And Nora sat in the middle of it all, watching Dante slip back into the cold, calculating man she'd first married. The one who saw problems as obstacles to be eliminated rather than complications to be navigated. She understood why. He was fighting for survival, for everything he'd built, for the empire his injury had nearly cost him. But watching him become that person again hurt in ways she hadn't anticipated. "We could just tell the truth," Nora suggested during a particularly tense strategy session. "Beat her to the story. Admit that, yes, we married for the inheritance, but somewhere along the way, it became real. People love a redemption arc." "People love destroying powerful men more," Dante said flatly. "The moment we admit any part of this was fabricated, the trust lawyers will invalidate everything. We have to deny it completely, discredit the source, and pray the story dies before it gains traction." "And if it doesn't die," Nora asked, "if she publishes anyway and people believe her?" Dante's silence was answer enough. The break came 36 hours before the story was scheduled to run. Marcus burst into Dante's office where they'd been camped out for most of the day, his expression grim but triumphant. "It's Isabella," he said without preamble. "She's the source. Had one of her lawyers pull files from the trust challenge, found evidence of the payment structure, and handed everything to the journalist. She's been working this angle since she showed up here, and you turned her down." Of course it was Isabella. Nora felt the pieces click into place with horrible clarity. The timing of her visit, her fury when Dante chose Nora over her, her parting threat about Nora getting hurt because she didn't understand the rules. This was revenge, pure and calculated, designed to destroy Dante by destroying his marriage. "Can we stop her?" Nora asked. "We can make her very sorry she tried," Dante said, his voice carrying a weight that made Nora's skin prickle. "Marcus, I want every piece of leverage we have on the Marchese family pulled and ready to use. Financial irregularities, questionable business practices, family secrets they've paid to keep buried, all of it." "Dante," Nora started, but he cut her off. "No, she came into my house, looked you in the face, and then went behind our backs to ruin both of us. She doesn't get mercy, she gets consequences." The fury in his voice was familiar. This was the man who ordered bodies dumped in rivers, who built his empire on fear and violence, who didn't forgive betrayal. Nora had known he was capable of this, had seen glimpses of it in overheard conversations and careful avoidance of certain topics. But seeing him embrace it so completely, watching him become the monster his mother had warned against, made her realize just how fragile their happiness had been. "If you do this," Nora said quietly, "if you destroy Isabella the way you're planning to, you become exactly what she accused you of being, a man who solves problems with threats and intimidation. Is that who you want to be?" "It's who I need to be to survive," Dante said, not looking at her. "You want me to be better, to choose mercy over violence, to transform into some kind of reformed criminal. But that's not reality, Nora. Reality is that people like Isabella will always see kindness as weakness and use it against you. The only way to win is to be more ruthless than your enemies." "And if winning costs you everything that matters?" Nora asked. "If you save your empire but lose yourself in the process?" "Then at least I still have the empire," Dante said, and the coldness in his voice made Nora's heart crack. She left the office before she said something she couldn't take back, before the anger and disappointment building in her chest exploded into words that would damage them both. She understood survival, had made her own terrible choices in the name of it, but somewhere along the way she'd started to believe that Dante was different, that he could choose to be better, to build something real instead of just protecting what he'd taken. She'd been wrong about that too. Nora was packing when Dante found her, wheeling himself into her room. Their room, she corrected mentally, because she'd stopped sleeping in the East Wing weeks ago, and stopping when he saw the suitcase open on the bed. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Leaving," Nora said, not looking at him. "Before the story breaks, before everything falls apart, before I become collateral damage in whatever war you're planning to wage against Isabella." "You signed a contract," Dante said. 6 months. We're not even halfway through. The contract said I'd play your wife, attend your events, maintain appearances. It didn't say I'd watch you become the worst version of yourself and pretend to be okay with it." Nora finally turned to face him, and the pain in her chest made it hard to breathe. "I fell in love with the man who stood for me at the reception, who took me to his mother's greenhouse, who admitted he was scared and asked me to try anyway. But that man just threatened to destroy someone out of revenge, and I don't know if he's coming back." "You fell in love with me?" Dante's voice was barely above a whisper, and all the cold calculation had drained from his face, leaving only raw vulnerability. "Of course I did," Nora said, tears burning her eyes. "I'm an idiot who fell for someone I was supposed to be pretending with. But I can't watch you sacrifice everything good about yourself just to win. I can't be the reason you become the monster your mother warned you about." Dante stared at her for a long moment, something enormous shifting behind his eyes. Then he wheeled himself to the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with tension. "My mother told me something else," he said finally, "the day before she died. She said that the people worth keeping in your life are the ones who make you want to be better, even when being worse would be easier. She said if I ever found someone like that, I should hold on to them with everything I had, because they're rarer than any amount of power or money." He turned to face Nora, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. "You make me want to be better," he said simply. "You make me question every instinct I have toward violence and revenge. You make me think maybe my mother was right, that staying human is more important than winning. And you're right. I was about to destroy Isabella because it's what I've always done, because being ruthless has kept me alive this long." "But?" Nora asked softly. "But I don't want to be that person anymore," Dante said, and the admission seemed to cost him everything. "Not if it means losing you. Not if it means becoming something you can't love." Nora's hand stilled on the suitcase. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we call Isabella. We tell her we know she's the source, and we give her a choice. She pulls the story, signs an NDA, and disappears from our lives permanently. In exchange, we don't retaliate. We don't destroy her family. We don't leak her secrets. We don't do any of the things I was planning. We let her walk away, and we survive whatever fallout comes from the story if she refuses." "That's not ruthless," Nora said. "That's mercy. That's me choosing you over my empire," Dante corrected. choosing who I want to be over who I've been, choosing to trust that maybe love and honesty are stronger than fear and control. The words hung between them, weighted with significance that went far beyond the immediate crisis. This was Dante offering transformation, offering to become the man his mother had hoped he could be, offering to build something real instead of just protecting something broken. This was Dante choosing Nora, completely and without reservation. "Okay," Nora said, her voice shaking. "Let's call her." Isabella answered on the third ring, her voice wary. "Dante, I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I know what you did," Dante said, his voice calm and controlled. "I know you're the leak, that you gave the journalist everything she needed to destroy my marriage and invalidate the trust. And I know why. Because I chose Nora over you, and you couldn't handle it." Silence on the other end, then Isabella's cold laugh. "Are you calling to threaten me? Because I've already given the story to multiple sources. Whatever you're planning to do to shut me up, it's too late." "I'm calling to offer you mercy," Dante said. And Nora heard the cost in his voice, the difficulty of choosing this path over the easier, more violent one. "Call off your journalist, sign an NDA. Walk away from this, and I'll let you. No retaliation, no consequences, no using everything I know about your family's business dealings to destroy you. You get to leave clean." "And if I refuse?" Isabella asked, suspicion clear in her tone. "Then the story runs, the trust gets challenged, and we all lose. Me, you, Nora, everyone connected to this mess. But at least I'll know I gave you the chance to do the right thing before everything burned down." More silence. Then Isabella's voice, different now, smaller, almost uncertain. "You're serious. You're actually offering to let me walk away." "I'm choosing to be better than my worst instincts," Dante said quietly. "Something someone very important recently reminded me was possible. So yes, I'm serious. You have 24 hours to decide. After that, whatever happens, happens." He hung up before Isabella could respond, then looked at Nora with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and hope. "I can't believe I just did that." "I can," Nora said, moving to him, her hands finding his face. "Because you're not the monster you think you are. You're someone who's been fighting so long you forgot there were other ways to win." Dante pulled her down into his lap, his arms wrapping around her like she was the only solid thing in his world. "If this backfires, if she publishes anyway, and I lose everything, then we figure it out together," Nora said firmly. "We face whatever comes, and we survive it. Because that's what we do." They stayed like that for a long time, holding on to each other while the world outside continued to turn and the clock counted down toward Isabella's decision. It should have been terrifying, leaving their future in the hands of someone who'd already proven she wanted to destroy them. Instead, Nora felt something like peace settling into her bones. They'd made a choice, not the smart choice, not the strategic choice, but the right one. The choice that let them sleep at night. The choice that kept them human. Whatever came next, they'd face it honestly. Isabella called 18 hours later, her voice clipped and professional. "The journalist has agreed to kill the story in exchange for an exclusive on something else, a corruption scandal in the mayor's office that I happen to have documentation for. Your marriage is safe, for now. I'll sign your NDA, and then I'm leaving the city." "We're done, Dante. Truly done." "Thank you," Dante said, and meant it. "Don't thank me," Isabella said bitterly. "I'm not doing this because I suddenly grew a conscience. I'm doing it because destroying you won't give me back what I lost. And because—" She paused, then continued quietly, "because maybe you're right. Maybe Nora is better for you than I ever was. Maybe she can give you something I couldn't." She hung up before Dante could respond, leaving them in the sudden, stunning silence of a disaster averted. "It's over," Nora said, barely able to believe it. "We're safe." "For now," Dante agreed. "But Nora, I need you to understand something. The trust deadline is in 2 weeks. After that, the marriage has served its legal purpose. You could walk away, take your money, go back to your life. The contract would be fulfilled." "Is that what you want?" Nora asked, her heart in her throat. "No," Dante said immediately. "But I need to know it's not what you want either. I need to know that you're staying because you choose to, not because you feel obligated. Because what I feel for you, it's not gratitude and it's not convenience. It's love. Real, complicated, probably going to mess this up. Sometimes love, and if you don't feel the same. Nora kissed him before he could finish the sentence, poured everything she felt into that kiss, the fear and the hope and the absolute certainty that whatever they'd started as, they'd become something worth fighting for. I'm staying, she said when they finally broke apart. Not for the money, not for the contract. I'm staying because I love you and because I want to see who we become when we're not performing anymore. Dante's smile was incandescent, transforming his entire face. Then marry me again, for real this time. After the trust deadline passes, after all the legal obligations are satisfied, marry me because you want to, not because you need to. You're asking me to marry my own husband, Nora said, laughing through tears. That's ridiculous. It's perfect, Dante corrected. We'll do it right this time. A real ceremony, your grandmother there, vows we actually mean. A beginning instead of a transaction. Yes, Nora said, and the word felt like freedom. Yes, I'll marry you again, as many times as you want. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of final preparations, trust administrators reviewing documentation, and the slow, careful process of building a real relationship on the foundation of a fake one. Dante's recovery accelerated dramatically, Dr. Ross noting that his patient's improved emotional state was translating into remarkable physical progress. He graduated from the walker to a cane, then to taking short walks with just Nora's arm for support. The trust deadline came and went without incident. The legal requirements satisfied, the inheritance secured. Vincent and Luca made noises about challenging the results, but without evidence of fraud, they had no grounds. Dante had won, but more importantly, he'd won without becoming the monster he'd feared. Nora's grandmother was released from rehabilitation, healthy and vibrant and completely shocked when Nora finally told her the truth. Not all of it, not the parts about organized crime and contract marriages, but enough. Enough to explain that she'd met someone, fallen in love, and wanted her grandmother at the real wedding. I knew there was something you weren't telling me, her grandmother said, but she was smiling, her eyes bright with tears. I'm just glad you found someone worth keeping secrets for. The second wedding took place 6 months after the first, in the greenhouse where Dante's mother used to find clarity, surrounded by people who actually mattered. Nora's grandmother, looking healthier than she had in years. Dr. Ross, who'd become something like a friend during the long months of therapy. Mrs. Castellano, who'd somehow evolved from stern disapproval to grudging affection. Even Julian standing off to the side with what might have been pride in his usually unreadable expression. This time, when the officiant asked if Dante took Nora to be his wife, he said, I do, like it was the most important truth he'd ever spoken. This time, when Nora was asked the same question, she answered without hesitation, without doubt, without any of the fear that had colored their first ceremony. And this time, when they kissed, it wasn't for show, or strategy, or maintaining appearances. It was because they wanted to, because they'd chosen each other freely, because love had somehow grown in the spaces between desperation and survival. The reception was small, intimate, nothing like the political circus of the first one. They danced, really danced this time. Dante on his feet without support, his recovery complete enough that he could hold Nora and move with her through a song that actually meant something. No regrets? He asked, echoing his question from that first morning they'd woken up together. Not even one, Nora said, and meant it with her whole heart. Later, after the guests had left and they were alone in the greenhouse with champagne and the comfortable silence of people who didn't need to fill every moment with words, Dante told her about his plans. He was restructuring the business, moving away from the illegal operations that had defined his empire, investing in legitimate ventures and using his considerable influence to actually help rather than exploit. It'll take years, he admitted, and I'll probably never completely wash away what I've done. But I want to try. Want to build something my mother would be proud of. Something we can pass on to, he paused, then continued with a smile, to whatever comes next. Nora leaned into him, fitting perfectly against his side like they'd been designed to complement each other. Whatever comes next, she repeated. I like the sound of that. A year after their second wedding, Dante stood at the podium of a community center he'd funded, announcing the launch of a foundation dedicated to helping families afford life-saving medical treatments. Nora stood beside him, now a licensed nurse working part-time at the hospital where her grandmother had received her transplant, splitting her time between patient care and managing the foundation's operations. Her grandmother sat in the front row, healthy and vibrant, holding hands with the man she'd started dating at the rehabilitation center, a retired teacher with kind eyes and a gentle sense of humor. She caught Nora's eye and smiled, and Nora saw nothing but love and pride there. No judgment for the choices she'd made, no resentment for the lies she'd told. Just gratitude for the second chance they'd both been given. As Dante spoke about the importance of access to healthcare, about families who shouldn't have to choose between financial ruin and watching loved ones die, Nora thought about the girl who'd agreed to marry a stranger to save her grandmother. That girl had been desperate, terrified, convinced she understood the price of her choice. She'd had no idea that the price would include falling in love, transforming someone's life while having her own transformed, and discovering that sometimes the worst decisions led to the best destinations. That evening, curled up together in bed, the bed they'd shared for months now, in the house they'd made into a home, Dante told Nora he loved her in 17 different ways without using those specific words. He told her with how he made her coffee exactly the way she liked it, with how he remembered every story about her day, with how he held her like she was precious and essential and the best thing that had ever happened to him. And Nora told him back in all the same ways, plus a few of her own invention, until they were both laughing and breathless and absolutely certain that whatever had brought them together, desperation, fate, or just dumb luck, had given them something worth every risk they'd taken. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd said no?" Dante asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. "If you'd thrown away Julian's card and found another way?" "Every day," Nora admitted, "and every day I'm grateful I was desperate enough to say yes. Because it brought me here, to you, to us." "To us," Dante echoed, kissing her forehead, "to terrible decisions that somehow worked out, to marriages that start as lies and become truth, to finding love in the last place either of us expected. To surviving together," Nora added softly, "and building something better than either of us could have built alone." Outside, the estate settled into comfortable darkness, security making their rounds, the world continuing its endless turning. Inside, two people who'd married for survival discovered that survival was just the beginning, that love could grow in the spaces between contracts and consequences. That transformation was possible, even for people who'd built their lives on violence and desperation. That sometimes the most honest things began as the biggest lies. And that choosing each other every single day was the only marriage vow that really mattered. Years later, when people asked Nora how she'd met her husband, she'd smile and tell them a version of the truth, that they'd met during one of the darkest periods of her life, that he'd offered her a way out when she had none, that somewhere between desperation and survival, they'd found something real. She'd leave out the contracts and the money, the threats and the danger, the performance that became reality. She'd leave out everything except the essential truth, that Dante Moretti had been broken when she met him, and so had she, and together they'd learned how to build something whole. That was the story worth telling. The rest was just details. And in the greenhouse that had witnessed their second beginning, where Dante's mother's carefully tended plants still thrived under Nora's care, where they came when the world felt too heavy and they needed to remember who they'd chosen to become. There, in that space filled with light and growth and the quiet persistence of things that refused to die, their story continued. Not as a mafia boss and the girl he'd paid to marry him, but as two people who'd looked at each other's broken pieces and decided to build something beautiful anyway. That was the ending they'd earned, the one they'd fought for, the one they'd chosen together. And it was, in every way that mattered, perfect.